Okay, so here we are again, Zac. Our monthly Monday afternoon look at the, I've forgotten the name of it, the Palgrave Male Psychology Handbook, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the chapter we're looking at today is Positive Masculinity, including masculinity as a valued aspect of humanity. It's a great title, isn't it?
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. And it's written by Martin Seager and John Barry. We've talked about them as authors before. So John's a chartered psychologist. I won't go through his very long bio, but just to say he was co-founder of the Male Psychology Network, and he was co-founder of the Male Psychology section of the British Psychological Society. And I feel every time I mention that, I want to say that about a third of the membership voted against there being a male psychology section. I don't know why, I just always want to mention that because I'm incredulous, absolutely incredulous. And Martin Seager, he's another co-founder of the Male Psychology Network, clinical psychologist and psychotherapist. He's a broadcaster, journalist. On mental health issues. I quite like that the way that was put. And worked for Samaritans for over a decade. I thought it was a really good chapter. It's like a breath of fresh air to practitioners, because a lot of the chapters we've read before have been quite academic, haven't they? And abstract and theoretical. But this was laced with takeaways for practitioners, so I really enjoyed that about it. I'll just say a couple more things and then we'll kind of chat about it. What I liked most was positive masculinity as a powerful antidote to the term toxic masculinity. I really liked that, and I liked the critique of social and cultural factors being the main influence on masculinity and masculine behaviours. That theory, critical theory, has been so critical of men. It's like hate speech, I think. Yeah, and again, I always appreciate the evolutionary, biological influences, archetypal. I just think are way more influential and kind of global and universal, that kind of thing. Yeah, lots of takeaways. Mainly this attitude of adopting a pro-masculine. I mean, it sounds obvious, doesn't it? But
and non-judgmental as well.
Yeah. And I think where I've come to is really wanting to appreciate traditional masculinity. Encouraging it, even if it's latent and presenting itself, and having traditional masculinity appreciated and an option amongst a number of other masculine identities, of traditional masculinity accepted as well, if we're going to be really diverse, if we are going to be really diverse. Yeah, so that's kind of where I'm up to with it. What about you?
So yeah, my impression of reading this chapter was that this is a really useful compression of a lot of the sprawling debate, and it feels like they've just kind of compressed it down into like defining some of the big tropes, like hegemonic masculinity, which was, you remember when I went to see that guy in the workshop in London in March, Dr. Michael Beattie, who works at the London Gender Clinic. Really lovely guy. I'm sure he's an amazing clinician, but he was very bought into this idea of the hegemonic masculinity, which is basically the Gramscian cultural Marxist idea of a pyramid of power, and men are supposedly at the top. And he was quite persuasive when he was describing it, but what these two have done in this in this chapter, Martin Seager and John Barry, is they've just put down like the really key points to refute it, and they don't go on about them too long. There's just 10 points saying like why hegemonic masculinity can't be true. And before that, they sort of mentioned the fact that there's just like no evidence for it, which
doesn't meet empirical research standards and is easily refuted.
Yeah. So it's kind of amazing the way these ideas are so, you know, unpopular. But I think what's really good about this chapter is it's just very pithy in just taking these ideas apart, but not it's not like it's done for, it feels like it's done for with a very sort of benevolent energy, that it isn't like a kind of partisan or kind of, you know, angry or anything like that. It's just sort of saying, look, this appears to have kind of been getting a lot more out of hand in the last, well, this is me talking now, but these ideas have got so powerful that it's just really difficult to get out of them. But here's just reading those 10 points is, for me, was really kind of refreshing, because it's just reassuring to see that it's actually quite straightforward, and the facts are really straightforward, and these are just ideologies basically. So they debunk hegemonic masculinity, and then they debunk toxic masculinity, and we can go into how they do that, can't we? And then they look at hyper masculinity, which I didn't know that much about that, and then just drawing in elements of what we've already talked about in the other chapters, you know, for the conclusion. Absolutely. Mentioning Farrell and Gray, I guess that's the book, The Boy Crisis, which I love.
Yeah.
In fact, that's why I initially got into this work. I read that and I was just like, oh my God, why doesn't anyone know about this? I was really shocked.
There's a lovely interview, I don't know if you've seen it, he's done with John Anderson, Warren Farrell, with John Anderson recently.
Right, no, I haven't.
So he's just so knowledgeable, isn't he? And I love, calls himself an independent scholar.
And he's, you know, I'd love to challenge anyone to read his work and feel that he's got something against women or something like that. Like he's just trying to help people, you know. It's not, he's have an agenda.
This is what Cassie J found, wasn't it, with all the men's rights activists that she interviewed for her documentary, The Red Pill. Not a single one of them had an axe to grind with women. You know, not a single one of them wanted, for example, money or rights or anything taken away from women. They just would like similar rights extended to men and boys. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Should we just go through? We can sort of go through the chapter and then maybe talk around stuff that came up for us.
Yeah. Should we talk about the what was the first one? Hegemonic. What's the first one?
Hegemonic masculinity. So yeah.
You know, I'm very angry and mad that has been squirreled into anything to do with gender at all, because hegemony has never had anything to do with gender.
Well, it'd be, we could start. Why don't we start at, you know, we both went to university, didn't we? I went to Goldsmiths in London, and I studied anthropology, social anthropology, and that's quite a good place to start with this stuff, because as these two, Seager and Barry, say, the study of gender in Western academia has been deeply influenced by feminism, and it's taken on sociological socio-political, social, psychological, and anthropological stances. And yeah, like this is really where I was at in whenever I was at uni, 2001 to 2004. It was very much gender was starting to turn up on a lot of the modules I was doing, and the idea of hegemonic power. I don't know, I can't actually remember if we were getting into hegemonic masculinity at that point, but it was very much like it's a world view which sees everything as a function of power. It's kind of coming from Foucault and Derrida, and you know, those sort of French thinkers, postmodernist, deconstructivist sort of thing. Were you doing something like that back in the 80s?
Yeah. I did an open university degree. I have to say, it was a social sciences one. I have to say that there was actually some Roger Scruton, and there was some.
What?
Yes.
I love Roger Scruton.
I do too. Yeah. Oh, rest in peace.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, but it was still telegraphed to you that.
That's
really,
like.
Yeah, we've got to put that into balance. But this is where your values should lie, is with the swing Marxist, radical feminist.
Yeah.
And I was brainwashed, and I have to say that I ended up feeling quite superior to men. I was a horrible, horrible partner, always kind of looking down my nose and offering advice, and so for about 15 years I felt I was under the influence of radical feminism. And in fact, the little talk that I'm doing for the same conference that you're doing the talk for, I'm introducing myself as Sue Parker Hall, a recovering radical feminist.
Wow.
Yeah, because it had a profound impact, and it made me hateful.
Yeah, I mean, I remember just being very, very, very up for equality, and sort of just being quite, like this all sounds pretty good to me. Even though I can't remember detecting in my personal life ever coming across any kind of examples of like any of my sisters or my mum being oppressed by males. I was just like assuming that it was the case. Otherwise, why would there be all this stuff about it? And at that time I had a Finnish girlfriend, and it's a very egalitarian society. So I was quite up for that, because it meant that I only had to pay half towards the dinner bill, and like we just cut everything down the middle, which I thought was great, because I thought like I would kind of still be up for. I don't know whether I'd still be up for that or not. I kind of like buying dinner. This is going off point anyway, but I think the first time that I discovered that maybe there wasn't equality was when I became a father, and it came as a real shock. I had no sense before that there were these massive inconsistencies. Anyway, I'm going off point, aren't I? But kind of interesting just to touch back to that, though, isn't it? Like these like rhetorical, these narratives are based in the sociological literature, which then go into the media, because everyone in the media is coming from degrees like I did and you did, and
they do meld personal. We've brought our personal story to it now, haven't we? We all do bring agendas, don't we?
Of course.
I like what Lacan said about texts read us rather than the other way around. I like that.
and we take on the lexicon and language of the kind of knowledge that we're exposed to, and then we start reproducing it, and then that starts to create our reality, and it's a symbiotic kind of dialectical thing, isn't it?
Exactly. And I realised I was so vulnerable to radical feminism because I was traumatised and had very low self-esteem. So anything that, you know, was championing and I'm inflating myself.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like I remember the sort of sense of exhilaration of like starting to see the US as this evil empire when I was that age, and I was sort of like, it felt quite exhilarating, the idea that we could take, you know, I could be against institutions and countries, and like, to be the underdog and to be the rebel kind of feels quite exciting, doesn't it? And
yes.
Anyway, so hegemonic masculinity. Here's the 10 reasons they give that it's just not true. So they start just by saying, look at working class men in the UK.
Yeah.
They experience poverty, powerlessness, illness, hardship, high death rates.
Yeah.
And this has been the case across time.
Yeah.
And they live, actually globally, they live 5 to 6 years less, longer than women.
Yeah.
Which is not really mentioned very often. It's sort of acknowledged, isn't it, by most people that men have shorter lives, but it's never really, no one's ever like asking why. It's just like, isn't that's maybe interesting?
Yes, kind of thing. No.
Yeah.
I heard that testosterone might be a cause of shorter life. I don't know if you've heard that. Anyway, I'm just leaving it hanging there as a point of interest. But
I don't. Yeah, it is interesting.
Yeah.
So if I guess that they're saying, like, if there was this pyramid of hegemonic masculinity with men at the top and women on the bottom, then why are so many men, like massive, large numbers, male population, dying and getting ill and having horrible lives?
Not even on the pyramid.
Or not even on the pyramid. And then this classic point that's been made by loads of people, which I love, is like denial of the vote, you know, to 44% of men until the end of the First World War, and only then, because huge numbers of men had died horrible deaths across all classes.
Yeah.
And it was sort of like a kind of like, oh, better give them something to give back. And then like ongoing war deaths.
Yes. Yeah.
They
point out about the power of women, don't they? The domestic power of women within households, within families, and particularly in relation to children.
And then, like the point you made once, I think in that workshop that we did, the protective sacrificial behavior of men, you know, using the example of the Titanic, where the survival ratio percentages were 73% if you're a female and 21% if you're a male.
Where is that being, you know, celebrated, or, you know, people being grateful for, or you know, honouring or remembering those sacrifices?
The fifth reason is boys are educated and socialized primarily by women. So if there is this thing as a so-called thing as hegemonic masculinity, why aren't, I don't know if they actually say this in the chapter, but why aren't women kind of educating that out of them? And I mean, given that hegemonic masculinity is based on the idea that gender is learned and socialized and it's not biological, then why are all these boys turning up in the pyramid, the so-called pyramid?
Yeah.
So in the UK, 15% of primary school teachers are male. Well, that was in 2016.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yes. What does it say? Something like Finland is the only country in the developed world where school-aged children spend more time, 8 minutes
a day.
8 minutes a day, yeah, with fathers and mothers. Yeah. Is that 8 minutes more? It must be 8.
Yeah, it's 8 minutes more. Was my take on it.
Yeah, because it's a little bit confusing.
Yeah.
Yeah, 8 minutes more with fathers. Yeah.
I would be interested to see if this rhetoric is as mainstream in Finland about hegemonic masculinity. It is very egalitarian. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, I've forgotten. You know, when we did that presentation together, there was a country, wasn't there? I think it might be Norway, that had closed their gender studies departments. they weren't going to fund gender studies anymore. They kind of felt obsolete.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. What are they actually doing? It's quite a good question.
So there's a discussion, isn't there, about the high level of female online emotional abuse, the cyberbullying, and
yeah, they refer. There's research, isn't there? I didn't look into it, but they're giving research references, and it's all indexed at the end of the chapter. Loads and loads of references. So
yeah,
I think I love this chapter because it's just like a kind of, it's pretty. It seemed to me pretty kind of robust. To have, I mean, it's going to be hard for people. No one's going to engage with it if they don't already have empathy with men, probably. But it's a good one just to go like that. Look, just read this and look at these references, and then if you still think that we're living in a patriarchy, then fair enough. But we can at least kind of start from a basic level of like reality.
Being informed.
Yeah.
And the female physical violence in intimate partner relationships. I mean, it's one of the points I make in my anger and rage trainings over the years, is that lesbian relationships have the highest level of violence. Gay relationships and hetero relationships on a similar level, but lesbian relationships have a higher an incidence of domestic abuse. So that blows the patriarchy idea, completely out of the water. That's blown it out of the water for me for years. Gay relationships are just as turbulent as hetero. Lesbian relationships are more so.
Is that being consistently found? Is that one piece of research, or is it like this?
Yeah, there's a CDC, Centre for Disease Control, set of statistics that I've come across.
Why do you think that is?
It's a good question. I've never really thought about that. Why do I think it is?
Maybe we don't need to speculate, but I'm just curious.
Yeah.
I'm kind of thinking, well, maybe there's a sort of innate taboo on men exerting force against women. Well, there is. I mean, it's not a maybe. It's like a message. It's a message that's was consistently told to me all my life. Is like, a man never raises his hand to a woman. It's like, it's really kind of basic message.
And the vast majority of men don't.
Yeah. So women probably don't receive that message. Never raise your hand to another woman. So yeah, maybe it's that.
That's a really interesting research point, isn't it? It's an area. Yeah.
So point 7 on why hegemonic masculinity isn't real is, again, this is really kind of non-controversial stuff. Really much higher male suicide rate, much higher male rough sleeping rate, much higher male addiction rate, imprisonment, and more punitive sentencing for the same crime as women get, which is all there in the Ministry of Justice publicly available information.
Absolutely.
Point 8, young women receive more schooling. So the Guardian has even acknowledged that UK women are a third more likely to go to university than men.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, like as Warren Farrell explains in detail in his book, you know, and I think probably, what's his name? Steve Biddulph. I think he a while ago when he published his books, he started noticing that boys are doing badly in education, but it seems to be going kind of like getting more extreme. The disparity between boys and girls at school, and then secondary school and uni, is just going like that.
It is. And again, nothing really much seems to be being done about it, does it?
I don't think anything's being done about it, not that I know of. I mean, there's these ongoing kind of things that you hear about on, I don't want to be, it's been a long time since I listened to Women's Hour. I don't really listen to any media anymore, but I'm aware that there's this perception that women are kind of being blocked out of FTSE 100 companies, and they're being blocked out of careers in science and maths and stuff. But actually there's more females going into STEM subjects than men at university.
Are there?
Yeah. And medicine, medicine, dentistry, all that stuff is like more women than men going into it.
Psychology as well. There's many women in psychology, aren't there?
Yeah. So that's that. Point 9 is widespread evidence suggesting biologically influenced sex differences are there in human motivation and behavior. I'm just reading my notes. I don't know if they go into much more detail on that, do they?
No, mine don't go into any more detail than that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, they've talked about it. Seager talks about it quite a lot in his other chapter anyway. Like, this brain structures.
Yeah. And testosterone.
What testosterone does.
It's a major biological.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
And again, I want to say it's uncontroversial, but it is actually quite controversial to acknowledge that, isn't it? That there's a biological difference between males and females.
Yes, but only kind of within the social sciences, or and only, you're not supposed to say there's a difference. I'm just reading Deborah So's book called Ending Gender, and she's so straight down the line. There's only 2 genders, she says, and there's chapter after chapter of her articulating how and why that is, and this blurring of gender and sex. It's almost uncomfortable to talk about the sexes now.
Yeah.
The male sex, the female sex. We've kind of blurred it with the whole label of gender.
Well, yeah, it's a bit like, I mean, people don't really know what words to use or if they're going to put a foot wrong. So it has this sort of silencing effect, freezing effect on free speech. A bit like race did, before. Like, you wouldn't know whether you could ask someone at a party if they were, what's your heritage? If they don't look ethnically white British. Yeah. Some people are okay with that, but other people would be really offended. And it's difficult to know how to talk about these things, isn't it, without offending people? But I think that's part and parcel of like this ratcheting up of this sort of like polarizing.
And it's like, who says we can't offend people?
Yeah.
We're written that we can't offend people with different ideas.
I what was I going to say then?
Sorry, I took over.
Completely forgotten. Anyway, doesn't matter. What were we just saying before that?
Biological differences, testosterone, sex, gender.
Doesn't matter. The 10th point is that there are pro-social aspects to these archetypal masculine scripts of risk-taking, detaching from your emotions and aggression, where there are, high stakes situations like in combat or a fire or a earthquake or something. If someone's if a bus driver is sort of driving down the road and there's a massive kind of hole in the road, someone needs to stop him, and being nice about it might not work. So you need someone who's willing to kind of drive up. I'm just making this up, but like, jump out of a moving car onto the kind of bus, do a couple of rolls, then smash the window, and this is all the stuff we consume for forever in Hollywood. So why do we find it that surprising? It's like it's massive cognitive dissonance going on here. We all know this stuff. Like we know that this kind of deep drive to be risk-taking heroes is what men, boys aspire to, and men often just do it in the moment if they need to.
Yeah.
And you can be. Sorry.
No, go on. You haven't finished.
And you can be aggressive if it's serving, if it's in service to that role of protector.
Absolutely.
Of course you can.
In the talk I'm doing for the conference, I'm comparing the definitions of violence and aggression in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, and there's massive crossover. So they both appear very hostile things, phenomena. And then what I've said is there's a real important positive aspect of aggression. It's how we penetrate the world, how we protect ourselves, protect those we're responsible for. And I think a lot of men are shamed, women as well. I was shamed for my aggression. Actually, it's having an opinion or having a different opinion. I was shamed for my aggression. But I think a lot of men have been shamed out of their aggression. And I think it's really important in our work with men that we kind of encourage that nascent, natural, latent aggression, and that
it's a very powerful kind of creative force as well. This is probably going to sound a bit dubious, but I was talking to a friend the other night who goes to football matches a lot with his father, and they've always done it for years, and they share this sort of deep father-son bond, and then they go and they've got season tickets, and I'm not really that into football, but I have been a couple of times, and I found the chanting absolutely hilarious. I know that there's often a lot of like horrible stuff, and I don't like that, but there is a lot of humor, and there's a lot of like, it's almost like this kind of very rare space where men are just allowed to kind of channel or just let this stuff be, with loads, like thousands of other men, and then loads of like enemies on the other side of the thing, and it's a very kind of I'm really interested in that. I don't really know what my point is, but I just found it, this friend of mine, he's like a very responsible man in his like public life. He's like a responsible for a lot of people in a medical setting, and but nevertheless he finds this like slightly inappropriate outlet really meaningful, and
a bit edgy, a bit risky, a bit
and I really enjoyed talking to him about it.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's why hegemonic masculinity is a load of nonsense.
Yeah.
Is there anything in hegemonic masculinity that you think is like solid or helpful, or sort of what's the
Back to kind of
who's at the top?
male aristocrats, you know, or
But there
you
isn't.
know, yeah.
It's hard to make it work in any sort of way.
And there's a mistake as to where the power does lie, you know, and we don't have to get into that, but there is a mistake in where the real power in our society, in our world lies, and it's not in men in general, you know,
Not any
man on the
of the
street,
men that I know. No.
on the street, no.
Okay.
They're a bit of a scapegoat, actually, in a way. It's just occurring to me as we're talking. Men are a bit of a scapegoat for the ills of the world, really. Blaming them for something that they're actually not responsible for and don't have any power over. Just occurred to me.
So next concept that they debunk is toxic masculinity.
Yes.
Which you hate. You refuse to even use, don't you?
Yes, it's a toxic phrase, isn't it?
And
it's so, the authors are saying it's so widespread and it's uncritically accepted. It's, you know, there's no evidence base. It's all anecdotal.
Yeah.
And I love what they say, based on selected statistics, e.g. drunken frat house parties. I mean, that's not a big sample, is it? Or you know what I mean?
No, it's kind of it's more propaganda type rhetoric, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
And on one of the points where they pick it apart is around like taking a systemic look at human families and communities and populations as organisms. You know, a family is an organism and a community is an organism. So if half of the cells in that organism are toxic, then how come it's not always ill? Like, how come it's not always dysfunctional? You know, like there's too many examples of happy marriages and happy families and happy communities for this toxic masculinity thesis to hold any water. I mean, that alone should ring alarm bells. Like, what? There's no kind of I don't know what the word is. There's no like standards of I can't think of what the word is. But yeah, it's very sloppy, isn't it? There's no coherence to any of this stuff. It's
It is. Again, it's not science, is it? It's not science. It's not quantifiable.
No. And it sort of, if you push bits of it, they move, and then another argument sprouts up over there, but no one will ever respond to what you're saying here. It's just this sort of amorphous thing.
Yeah.
So their reasons for why toxic masculinity is nonsense. Well, the use of the word toxic itself, they're saying, is discriminatory and reveals a lack of empathy and gender bias, because it's not used anywhere else in social science. So it's actually, this attitude itself is actually toxic.
Yes.
Which is a really deep point, actually. It should, you know, the projection of this onto men shows something, doesn't it? Like, we all project our own stuff onto other people and other things.
Absolutely,
that we haven't processed. So it's an unconscious projection.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of men going through the family court system probably have horrible experiences of this kind of sense of being told that there's something really toxic about you, in a very toxic kind of way, you know, the way it's sort of, anyway, I'm going off point again.
No, I think it's a really important point you're making, and I think men carry a lot of the shame for everybody. I think,
do you want to go more into that, how men carry the shame?
Only a little bit, in as much as thinking of men in such a negative way and shaming them en masse. You know, you do that from a I'm okay high place, you know, so it's a way of I'm okay. It's them that are not okay. It's them that are shameful. It's them that are toxic. You know, it's that's all I'm thinking.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I think men, I don't know how to put this, Zac. I hope you can help me with this, but I think men are convenient for doing that on, and I don't quite know why.
Well, one of the points that they raise in this might explain that, which is that there's no in-group bias with men, but there is with women.
Yes.
So women are more likely to support each other because they're women.
Yes.
Whereas men never look to other men and feel solidarity because they're men. They only they only kind of feel loyalty to group and team. And so they'll be looking at family or other men if they happen to be part of the group or community or side that they're on. And but other than that, they can be quite silent. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that in the same way as they did.
I think that's a great explanation.
Men don't really moan as much, maybe, as well.
Right.
So.
Well, I do. You know,
they do.
I do talk about men as suffering without knowing they're suffering. You know, not really realizing that they're miserable. That's a kind of norm, and that's what it's like to be a man. Or
well, that's the what's he called? Matt Rudd, the Sunday Times columnist who just wrote that book called "Man Down: Why Men Are Unhappy."
Yeah,
he was trying to get into that, and right. I haven't read his book, but I spoke to him on that radio show the other day.
Oh yeah,
you remember? Yeah,
the Matt Rudd. Oh right,
Matt Rudd, and I think he was trying to get. I should probably read his book, but I don't know how. It didn't seem that deep, the conversation that we had, but in that radio interview, but. Yeah, it was almost like he was describing his own experience of suddenly realizing he was waking up in his own life, realizing he was quite miserable, even though he, on paper, should be happy because he's got this good job and he's got a nice house and a nice family and everything. But I'm really interested in that idea of men not realizing they're miserable.
And I use that I know it's widespread, the frog in the cold water.
Yeah.
Don't realise you're miserable or suffering until you reach the boiling point, and
well, then you die. and we did mention that men die earlier, and maybe it's something to do. There's a lot of cardiovascular disease and heart attack, and that's your connection between your heart and your brain and your how open-hearted you are, how in touch with your emotional life you are is it's all the same stuff. It's just different language for the same thing. And a lot of men are just sort of holding a lot of stuff without necessarily being conscious of it. And then, just die, just drop dead.
It's true.
Okay.
They talk about 2 levels of interpretation, don't they? There's a kind of stronger level that only masculinity can be toxic, you know.
And it's toxic for everyone,
Yeah, it's
including men.
global.
That's why they need to be re-educated.
Exactly, complete overhaul.
Yeah.
Yeah. Needing better socialization, better education, social engineering, in other words, isn't it? And then the weaker one is just some men, you know, just some men. The extreme end of a continuum. But the sense being the more masculine a man becomes, the more toxic he'll be, kind of idea. I don't like traditional masculinity at all, do they? Don't like
I spoke to another therapist when I went to that workshop in March.
Yeah.
Really nice woman.
Yeah.
And we had a good chat, and she was saying that she was seeing a man who she really was, you know, there was a good polarity there, i.e. that her feminine was very drawn to his masculine because he had this like quite, you know, not hyper masculine, she didn't use those words, but I got the sense that he was quite masculine, if that makes sense. But she was expressing her concerns because she was saying, but he is quite, you know, he's not that empathic with my child, and obviously it wasn't his child, so there was there's always a bit of a thing there, isn't there, anyway, with step kids and step parents.
Yes.
But she was very much how she was talking about it was very much like what you've just said. Like, so he was further down the masculine, you know, continuum, so therefore he was a bit more of a shit to her child, you know, like,
right,
and could be a bit more problematic in some of his behaviors.
Right.
And so I don't know, that just occurred to me because it's so
I do wonder, because I work a lot with step parents, you know, male and female step parents, and I do wonder how facilitative, you know, the mother of the child is in terms of cultivating a bond, you know, because I think it's really important for the blood parent to be responsible. Be responsible initially for the bonding between the step parent and the child, not just kind of pushing the step parent in to get on with it and find their own way, you know, scrabble about in the dark and make a lot of mistakes.
I love this. They mention two debates. So there's a debate in 2016 at Cambridge University, with the proposition, "This house believes masculinity is harmful to everyone," which was carried through. So everyone agreed. Well, it was agreed, you know, after the debate.
Yeah.
And then the next year at University College London, UCL, "Is masculinity toxic or a tonic?"
Yeah.
And in that one, they voted for the latter, so it was a more positive result. So I guess the authors are saying, look, you know, with debate, these ideas can actually be challenged, and people, you know, can realize that they're really inconsistent. So their flaws, the flaws that they list with toxic masculinity as a concept. Do you want to go through the first couple?
Yeah, sure. So it's a repeat of a point we made in terms of hegemonic masculinity, but they're mostly socialized by females. You know, where does the toxicity come from? And we do know that father absence has a negative effect, don't we?
Yeah, we looked at that in one of our videos, didn't we? ADHD, inappropriate sexual behavior, self-harming, and loads of neurological and emotional developmental stuff. There's loads on that,
Yes, there is. And, you know, the fact that most males behave in risk-taking and protecting ways rather than destructive ways in regard to women. I was very touched this morning. One of my clients arrived escorted by her husband. You know, he brought her to the gate. You know, she was tender, fragile, And yeah, so I was just very impacted by his kind of tenderness and kind of bringing her. Yeah. Yes, and more men are like that than not. Many, vastly more men are like that than not, aren't they?
Just had a thought. I mean, I don't want to go too off piste here, but you know, like in a lot of countries around the world, it's not safe for women to just walk out around at night, especially.
Mm.
And you know, in a lot of Arabic countries, it's just socially kind of prohibited anyway, because you know, well, I won't get into that, but I'm just wondering if the way that it's become so normal and so safe for women to just be, I'm not saying it's particularly safe. I mean, look at, you know, Rotherham. It's not actually that safe for a lot of women for different reasons, but there's this idea that men aren't really needed as bodyguards anymore, and that's really been one of our primary functions until very recently. Don't know if that's that relevant or not,
but possibly, but I do think a lot of protection that men offer goes unnoticed.
Yeah.
So most males behave in risk-taking and protective ways rather than destructive, and abusive and toxic behaviour is atypical. You know, it's an extreme, not statistically representative of the whole male population.
Yeah, so why would it be used as a...
I wonder why. I wonder why.
Well, yeah.
So it's bad science, they say, to generalise from the extreme to the...
Yeah, I'd go a bit further. I'd say it's actually really dishonest. It's not that hard to see that it's... That's one thing I sometimes wonder about, though. Do you reckon the people pushing it know that it's nonsense, or don't know that it's nonsense, and they're just not very insightful?
I don't know. We're into kind of second, third generation of it now, aren't we?
Yeah.
You know, which
people just want an easy life as well, don't they? They don't really want to have to get, you know, fired for having the wrong ideas.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
And actually, you know, if you've got a family to support, you need to keep your money coming in to you need to keep your job. There's probably a fair number of men out there, you know, pushing this narrative because of the pressures that they're under as men.
Well, say a bit more, Zac. How's that?
So I'm just wondering out loud, like, you know, all those men who are lecturers in social science departments in, you know, red brick universities.
Yeah.
How many of them are kind of promulgating this theory of toxic masculinity and hegemonic masculinity in the knowledge that it's nonsense, but in fear of losing their job if they actually say, hang on a minute, I don't really agree with this, I'd like to teach my students like other stuff, or at least challenge it.
Be frog marched off the campus. Yes.
Yeah, so it's not statistically representative. And I like their fourth point, which is quite Taoist, or do you say Taoist? I think you say Taoist, don't you? Yes, which is like masculinity as a concept can't be separated from femininity. It's a reciprocal thing, and there's polarity in the universe. You know, there's space, there's something and nothing, there's dark and light, there's feminine and masculine, in and out, up and down, hot and cold. You know, all of that stuff is the nature of the 3D reality that we're inhabiting, and like to say otherwise is just a sort of denial of reality.
Well, it's denial of the shadow, isn't it? It's this again, masculinity carrying the shadow, femininity's in the light, and
Which is interesting because it used to be the other way around, didn't it? It was the sky, father, son, and logic and reason in the Greek thought. It was all in the sky. That's the male, and then the feminine is under subterranean, snake, dark, passion.
Yeah.
And it wasn't seen as, and it wasn't framed negatively back then. I mean, Greek medicine was actually a blend of both those qualities, whereas like modern medicine has become completely distorted into this like purely medical, rational thing that doesn't take into account feelings. So you can get prescribed SSRIs for being depressed, but sent home to your like horrible life.
Yeah.
No interest in like looking into your unconscious. No support.
No, quite.
So
females exhibiting substantial levels of violence and aggression in personal and domestic relationships. We've touched on that before. Yeah. This is a good question. It's like, how can masculinity be both toxic to all and privileging at the same time?
I love that.
Yeah.
I should probably just be at the top, I thought, because it's just like, can someone just explain that?
Yeah.
And then we can maybe carry on talking about the other stuff afterwards, because just a waste of time.
And I have to say, all the men I work with, and none of them seem particularly privileged, and none of them are toxic. They're traumatized and troubled, just like the women I work with.
Well, there's at the end of the Warren Farrell book, The Boy Crisis, he gives some data on wealth and like net worth of it's data of people in the US. So I don't know how relevant it is for the UK, but it says over their lifetimes, men earn more, but they spend less, and when they die, they're worth less. So there's this like wealth transfer happening through everyone's lives where men are working more or earning more. I don't want to get into that, but I think it's generally because they work more uninterrupted years than women because they don't bear children. And so they're just transferring their wealth, and then they end up with less at the end, and then the women live longer. So it's like, how is that privilege? That's service.
Yes, it is.
Not privilege.
That's right.
Yeah.
This is going off a little bit, but I want to share it because it was an insight I had. I mean, it might be obvious, but it was an aha moment for me. I was thinking of intersectionality, and the hierarchy of all the different groups. Who's the most disadvantaged? Who's the least disadvantaged? And just thinking how divisive that was and how it sets group against group against group. And I thought, come on, I'm a psychotherapist. What do I think really holds people back? What really stops them fulfilling their potential? Is it their position in society, or is it how society views them, or is it more influential how traumatized they are? And that it's like a little light bulb that went on in me.
Totally.
It's how traumatized people are. It's whatever group they're in. They're not homogenous groups, and there's different outcomes in every group.
It's totally the case, yeah. And actually, a lot of wealthy people have really strange. No, don't want to use the word strange, but really don't have their needs met when they're growing up. When they're very young, they have, disturbed attachment, and then they develop these sort of coping mechanisms, like putting armor around their, themselves to cope, and then they emerge into adult life with these strategies that they then pass on to their children, and that doesn't sound that privileged to me. It just sounds like a lot of trauma.
And if you want to be intersectional about it, there's going to be privileged people, whatever that means, in every group.
I just hate that whole. Hate's a strong word, but I think it's really unhelpful,
It
as
is.
as a place to expend energy and resources, like
Yeah.
sitting around trying to calculate who's more disadvantaged. I mean,
Yeah.
you could do it with trauma. You could just start trying to compare everyone's level of trauma with a kind of rating or an index. And actually they've done that, I suppose, with the adverse childhood.
Yeah.
What's it called? Adverse childhood experience, ACEs.
Is it?
It's actually,
It's one of those, isn't it? Experiences, is it?
yeah, I can't remember, but it's kind of quite helpful. And now they've got, like, you know, international research in different countries that's all corroborating each other, and
You've got 3 or 4.
it's very helpful. But it's for children, and like I think when people get to adulthood, you know, that this obsession with intersectionality is going to make us less, not more, open to empathizing with traumatized people, because often the most traumatized people are the most apparently okay, aren't they? Often, not always, but they can be very competent, very very functional, and actually
absolutely.
No, that isn't obvious, and I think that's a really profound point, and I think I would like to hear that more, that it's not
I think I'd like to develop it more.
Yeah, I think it's a really profound point, Sue.
Thank you.
It's so human as well. It's so non-divisive, because everyone's traumatized. You know, like everyone's parents have been let them down in different ways, and we let our kids down in different ways. And this is like the tragedy of human life, isn't it? Of life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight.
Oh, thank you. It gave me a great deal of peace to think that, and a lot of hope, actually. That's probably where the inequity lies, because, you know, there is legal recourse now to almost any kind of inequality, isn't there? So that just gave me a lot more to think. Let's tackle trauma instead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it feels like that has to be coming, and it has to be inevitable at some point that comes more into mainstream, because the science is just overwhelming, isn't it, on neuroscience and trauma.
It is, totally is.
It's not an idea, it's like solid science. Okay, where were we?
So we're on number 7 now, aren't we?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we were just saying this point. Yeah, male perpetrators of sexual and physical violence and abuse tend to have a trauma history themselves.
Yeah.
So if there is toxic masculinity, then it is located in the individual person's history, not collectively in the male gender.
Yeah.
And so it's all about trauma. And perpetrators. This is quite an interesting piece of research by Murphy, who was studying men in a high security prison, and they were all sentenced for various serious offences against women. And I think Murphy found that 52% of them had been sexually abused by female abusers, acting independently. And there's this really deep point that, unlike women, men, when they're infants, their primary caregiver is of the same sex as the sex that they're later going to have a sexual attachment with. So if that primary attachment relationship is disturbed or damaging in some way, then we can predict that they would then go on to they may become perpetrators of sexual violence in some way. Which seems really kind of obvious, really, but Um, yeah.
Yeah. Or victims.
Or victims.
Mm. Mm. Number 9, Kimmel has attempted to link terrorism with toxic masculinity, but Hudson's shown that females have always played a key role also in terrorism, accounting, they say, for between a third and a half of terrorist groups worldwide. So that's interesting, isn't it?
And the 10th point is toxicity doesn't, it's the point we mentioned earlier, it doesn't make sense if you're looking at things systemically. So if you're looking at families or relationships or communities as organisms, then why would, if half of them are toxic, half of them are male, half of them are toxic, then why wouldn't they all just die? But they don't. You know, most relationships and most, I don't know, most, right.
Well,
What's the divorce rate?
It's quite high. It's about 1 in 2, isn't it? But
yeah,
the people keep
going back for more. Yeah. Yeah. And people actually do have, yeah, they do find happiness, don't they? They find functional relationships, and yeah. So that couldn't happen if masculinity was toxic, unless in all those cases masculinity was stripped out and the man was not masculine. But that's not, I don't know what that means.
No. All of the kind of toxic masculinity stuff is based upon about 1% of the population, isn't it?
Psychopaths.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's the rate of psycho?
1%.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So their point is really like masculinity itself isn't toxic, but emotional damage, neglect, alienation, and abuse of boys contributes to masculine types of toxic behavior later on in life. And it's probable that gender interacts with emotional damage. So damaged men behave differently to damaged women, although there are more similarities than previously thought in terms of intimate partner violence, child abuse, and terrorism. That
was one of the things that struck me. My first placement was in a women's refuge. And because some of the men weren't doing very well on the domestic abuse program, you know, the IDAP Duluth model program, the multi-organisational team, they said, would I be interested in working with them? And when I did the history taking, if you covered up the names and covered up the gender, that they had very, very similar early life histories of abandonment, neglect, abuse, mortality of a parent, you know, alcoholic, substance using parent, all exactly the same kind of early trauma.
It's really sad.
But again, I'd like to explore a bit more. Why are men carrying the shadow? Why are men carrying the shit?
Hey, well, that's the classic masculine thing to do, isn't it? Hold the line.
Yeah.
Go off and, you know, fight the monster and stay up all night on sentry duty. Go without, get cold, get frostbite, get blown up.
Yeah.
You eat all the shit for the women and the children.
Yeah. And not be thanked for it.
Well, it used to be thanked, but it was recognised, wasn't it, in other times, in other cultures. But yeah, so I like that. It's interesting, that point, carrying the shadow.
Something I'd like to look into a bit more, really.
It's almost like in a bad marriage, you know, like in a bad marriage, it's a really sort of facile term, but in a marriage, you know, sometimes people go through really difficult patches, And if we're conceptualizing this whole kind of meta story of the breakdown in balance between feminine and masculine that is playing out in these sorts of concepts, hypermasculinity, toxic masculinity, hegemonic masculinity, you know, they're kind of distortions. They're not true. They're not really authentic representations of reality, but they're coming from somewhere. So it's almost like you're in this kind of toxic marriage. I don't want to say toxic, but like a marriage that's struggling, and this sort of narrative is coming from the wife. I don't want to kind of, I'm sort of saying this as I'm thinking it, but but it's like a kind of, you know, it's quite full of bile, isn't it? It's quite poisonous, and it's quite negative, and it is quite toxic.
Yeah.
It's very hostile, and it's not really about trying to figure out how to make the marriage work. It's more about berating the husband for being such a dick and being such a annoying man. Like, God, I hate him. I hate men, and I hate my husband. And the man is sort of carrying that, maybe unconsciously or consciously, just sort of hoping that at some point, which I think is inevitable, at some point these things will just kind of break apart, and there'll be another thing that breaks open, which will be about deeper dialogue and a kind of coming back together and renegotiating what masculine and feminine balance looks like. But the whole relationship is so traumatized by so many, you know, like women have been through a lot of horrible stuff as well. It's not like women haven't had a horrible time in the past. And a lot of women have, you know, a lot of women are being hurt by these sorts of poisonous rhetorical things.
Yeah.
But it's got a momentum of its own. And I think why, like your point, why are men carrying the shadow? I guess it's because what else can men do? If they try to escalate it, it'll be, you can't, you know, maybe it's sort of a classic thing for the masculine to hold. When a woman is being, I'm thinking of David Dada's language here, you know, the guy that wrote The Way of the Superior Man. Did you read that?
No.
He sort of says these things like, when your woman is being really unreasonable and really infuriating and like really contradicting what she said before, and she's being impossible, and you know, you're starting to feel kind of disgusted by her in a way, because it's just like just such a nightmare. You don't know what to do. But your role, the divine masculine, is about holding that. That's what the divine masculine's there to do. And when the woman feels that you're holding her, then she can start to calm down, and then you can go back into connection. So I think there's something on a meta scale like that maybe happening, but it's not quite there yet. It's like it's only just starting. I don't know.
Yes, it's like it's not as cooperative as that, is it? It's and not as what is it?
I think men
at the moment you're just carrying the shit.
You're just carrying the shit. But I think what we need to do, I don't think it's down to women now. I think it's down to men to start modeling, like, what, okay, so you're really bitter, you know, there's all this bile coming, and okay, so how do we like kind of get, sorry, what do you want to say?
Sorry, I know I've interrupted, but I do feel I need to say it's not most women, is it? You know what I mean? Again.
Yeah, no, sorry. Yeah, I'm being a bit sloppy.
I know you're not saying that. I know you're not saying that. But just kind of wanting to say, I don't think most women are hateful towards men. You know.
No, totally agree.
It's this kind of small number, and who knows how small, of academics who've influenced a lot of people in the helping disciplines, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's
got more influence than it should have.
It's a contagion. I don't really want to use that word, but it's like it's unrepresentative of the normal people.
Yeah,
who you
exactly.
talk to, and everyone knows that on a certain level.
Yeah, yeah.
And the amount of people that know of, like, I mean, we all know people that have had horrible relationships, but it's always way more complicated than this narrative.
Yes,
Isn't
quite.
it? It's always way more complicated.
Yes, absolutely.
Mm.
So, the takeaway, I don't know what you're thinking, Zac, but for me, this whole idea of positive masculinity, and I would say positive traditional, I keep banging on about positive traditional masculinity, is a really powerful antidote to hegemony, toxic hypermasculinity. And just a whole lot more kind of gratitude and for what men do, and compassion for the thing, men, boys,
and celebrating and valuing.
Yeah.
Because there's long-term effects of not doing that, isn't there? Like they say, there's going to be it's corrosive on boys' self-image and self-esteem.
Yeah.
Yeah. It kind of undermines the ethical standards of our culture to just systematically ignore male victimhood and disadvantage.
Yeah.
So it's like in 1984 where people are, and it really did happen. I mean, it happened in the Soviet bloc, didn't it? People they'd just get really comfortable, really familiar with saying one thing and kind of shutting off what they really felt for so long that they didn't really remember. Yeah, it's a really kind of alienating thing to live in a culture that is consistently saying, no, red is blue and blue is red. What a unhealthy thing to be doing with our kids.
Yeah, quite. Setting groups of people against each other.
Yeah. So they're I'm trying to find the bit where they Kaislicker and Englar Carlson. Do you remember this bit? 2010 outlined 10 domains of positive masculinity where therapeutic connections can be made with men and boys that are actually that are actually kind of honing in on positive masculinity. And there's sort of 10 aspects of that they mention, which are male relational styles.
It's acknowledging their strengths, isn't it?
Yeah. And using that as a sort of base to build them up rather than knock them down, which I think is kind of what we've been concerned about. So that's why we set this up, isn't it?
Yeah.
So male relational styles, male ways of caring, generative fatherhood. What does that mean? Generative fatherhood.
Generative.
Yeah. I don't know.
No, I don't know.
It does. We can look into it another time. Male self-reliance, which I think I always come back to that a lot. Like, stoicism. That was given as a real negative when in the literature that I've looked at.
It is in the American Psychological Association.
Yeah, you've mentioned that before. Yeah. The worker provider tradition of men, male courage and risk taking, the group orientation of boys and men. So they're looking to the team rather than the individual, and they're not looking at in-group bias. They don't really care if you're a man or a woman or a dog. If you're on the team, then they're orientated towards the team. The humanitarian service of fraternal organizations. So I don't really know what they're referring to there. I'm thinking.
Well, are they suggesting that we need to acknowledge, I don't know, one of the things I say about men is that, you know, a lot of them are involved in charities, aren't they? Or coaching kids and boys and, you know, giving up a bit of spare time for their community. Is it something to do with that? Or is that?
What's a fraternal organisation though? Is that just men?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. What's an example of that?
Round table or something? I don't know.
I don't know what, I can't think, I don't know of any, but I'm kind of curious as to that.
Yeah.
I don't know, where are these guys from? Are they, you know, maybe it's different in their country or something.
No, they're English, both of them.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, and I love men's use of humour.
Yeah.
That's so, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's interesting evolutionary psychology stuff around that, which is like positing humour as a sort of, you know, a way of becoming more of a desirable mate.
Yes, definitely.
Because it is,
Yeah.
well, the theory is that, you know, it's more developed in the masculine mind than the feminine mind, humour.
Yeah.
Is that your experience? I feel like I don't really want to just say
I
that with unsubstantiated.
One of the podcasts I did was about men being attractive to women, and their altruism was the most attractive quality. So if they were altruistic and physically attractive, they were top of the.
Yeah.
But if they were altruistic but not very attractive, they were the second layer. And then another study showed that sense of humour was important because women construe it as being more intelligent, wittier and funnier.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's like the third thing. And they said that the men that were just handsome were appropriate for one night stands, which felt a bit rude. That's what they said. That's what
Who said that?
I can send you the research, or we can put it in the window. Canadian. It was I think it was.
This is what Canadian women were saying. It's like a survey. Okay.
Yeah, Canadian women. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Cool. Okay. Oh yeah, and then the tenth thing that they're saying is good to work with is male heroism. So there's ways of framing like therapy to men that kind of, rather than rubbing against these aspirational, deep archetypal things, they can kind of support them. So it's like, do you want to support your family by getting support with me as a therapist, so that we can enable you to keep looking after your family, but you've got to look after yourself first? And then that sounds more appealing, rather than like, you know, come in here and just be like a mess and be really weak. And that's a horrible word to use, but I think men kind of can see it as like, oh no, if I do that, then I'll definitely never be able to be a provider anymore.
Well, you're talking about the very early stages, aren't you? Where you're inviting men into therapy.
Yeah, so the language on your website, the language that you have on the first few interactions.
Yeah.
And they approach, they can approach it like, I've got this problem, I want to take action to fix it. And just to go with that language. It's like,
well, I was looking at a Venn diagram the other day of feelings, thinking and behaviour, and thinking, because it was a male presentation, I thought, it really made me think about how you'd present that to men. And I was thinking, behaving, feeling, thinking, they're all very neatly and equally crossing over in the Venn diagram, but actually probably a lot of people are only going to operate mostly in two of those.
Yeah.
And it's about each therapeutic relationship having a different blueprint, if you like, a different lesson, and not assuming, like overemphasizing the emotional element of processing can put a lot of men off. That's not to say there aren't a lot of men that do the emotional processing, but it's about waiting and seeing, you know, and not assuming that yeah, the emotional processing is, you know, the most effective because it isn't
That's
present.
completely right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
yeah, they're saying, well, this, I'm still on the Kaislicker and Englar Carlson. What a mouthful. Piece. They say much more attention should be focused on studying those aspects of masculinity that are worthy of emulation.
yeah,
I totally agree with that.
yeah,
And
yeah,
yeah, I'm so up for that.
yeah,
Um,
definitely.
and there's research that says, you know, there's been 34 studies that show traditional masculine virtues can become healthy resources for men coping with depression.
Yes.
So these kind of things are taking control through information gathered and relying on your own resources.
Yeah.
Beating depression and regaining control by becoming independent from medication, physical activities, and reframing depression as a heroic struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's all pretty like obvious, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Maybe it's not obvious. I don't know. It just seems really amazing that we have to write this. Someone's had to write this in 2020.
Yeah.
Right.
I agree with you. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you.
And there was one bit that I found, you remember earlier in our discussion today, you were saying how a third of the board or the third of the members of the British Psychological Society voted against the male psychology section. Well, there was a bit in here, I can't remember where, but it was talking about how there's been obviously there was a campaign against conversion therapy. So the therapy that aims to convert homosexual people to heterosexual. And but despite that, there was oh god, I'm gonna have to find it because I want to get this right. I found it quite shocking. Sorry, just bear with me. Conversion therapy. So this is probably really painful for anyone still viewing our video. Oh yeah, here we go. I'm just going to read it out. So, so it's the bit where they're talking about various forms of feminist therapies exist that are said to be applicable to male clients. For example, feminist multicultural therapy and the Duluth Domestic Abuse Intervention Project. Perhaps not surprisingly, the empirical evidence for the effectiveness of these approaches is underwhelming. Even for very widespread interventions such as Duluth, it seems unlikely that such approaches meet professional standards of ethics in terms of being judgmental, unempathic, and non-collaborative when it comes to male clients. And I would agree with that, yeah. But then this is the really juicy bit. It might be thought that a reassessment is needed, but the chronic issues with interventions based on this negative approach to masculinity don't appear to have been noticed in mainstream psychology. Indeed, a recent initiative within the UK Division of Clinical Psychology called the Power Threat Meaning Framework suggests that power imbalances such as patriarchy and masculinity contribute to the creation of mental health problems, especially in women. The PTM framework has subsequently been criticised as a hybrid social constructionist, anti-psychiatry, anti-science and political agenda, more manifesto than scholarly document. The blindness to this crusade to reform masculine identity is very ironic, however, at a time when the British Psychological Society has worked so hard to outlaw conversion therapy for homosexuality.
It's a
And
really,
that,
really good point.
it's shocking, really, isn't it? That
Yeah.
this is just so,
It's
yeah,
like
I
quite
don't know,
rightly.
don't have a word for it.
Yeah, quite rightly, we don't engineer or get involved in somebody's sexuality, but it's okay to meddle about in their gender, if they're male.
Yeah. Have you got any final thoughts? The conclusion is, yeah, it's nothing.
Yeah, just about male victimhood,
Yeah,
really, rendered invisible, and the empathy gap. I think that's what needs to be cultivated more empathy, doesn't it?
yeah, and there's, I think we've touched on it a couple of different times today, but there's something about masculinity that doesn't seem to engender empathy somehow, and it's embodied as well. It's like that is the deep drive, is to go and hold the perimeter and do all the nasty jobs,
Yeah.
and not need that and not ask for it.
Yeah.
So I would just want to be careful that we don't, this whole thing about saying to men, you need to just be different, you need to talk more, like that author from the Sunday Times that I was talking to was sort of saying, look, the answer is that men need to be basically more like women. And it's like, no, that's that isn't it. That isn't
No.
it.
No.
Maybe it is a bit, but not. Yeah. And the absence of an in-group bias, they're saying, has contributed to the invisibility of male victimhood.
Yeah.
And empathy gap. And I
Yeah.
think that I hadn't really thought about that before, but that's really resonating with me, that there is not an in-group bias with men.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't experienced it anyway.
No.
Although I have to say, like, I have thought often to myself, like, I feel quite lucky not to have a period and to have to go through all the stuff that women go through. I mean, it's gnarly.
Yeah.
And I've got a lot of respect for women for having to go through all of that stuff. And I think women are quite split, because they're a victim of these rhetorics as well, because they're like trying to be out there doing everything that males are doing, but also they've got their biological kind of stuff to deal with. And how do they do that? That's very polarized. I don't understand. I don't think it's very easy.
That's nice. Some empathy for females as well.
It's good to do this again. It's been a bit of a long gap, hasn't it?
Yeah, no, it's been really good. I've really enjoyed it. It's like,
yeah. Let's do another one soonish.
Yeah.
Shall I choose the next one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, your turn. Yeah.
Cool.
Right.
Good luck with your video. Really looking forward to seeing it.
Well, thank you, and yours.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And we'll share those videos on our thing, won't we?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Yeah. So shall I give the title of mine and you give the title of yours? Just as
yeah, good idea. Yeah.
Yeah. So mine's called Male Shame. Could psychotherapy be to blame? And could improve its aim? That's my title. What's your title?
I'm just looking it up. I'm looking at the just bear with me. Here we go. Working with the trauma of losing child access. So it's about my work supporting fathers through the trauma of losing contact with their children against their wishes, that might involve the family court system and mental and financial breakdown.
Yeah.
And so my work, I run a group for separated fathers who are in this sort of toxic experience of living in fear, anger, rage, and grief in what can feel like a silent void when these emotions are not understood or accepted in the family court system. Mainstream perpetrator programs like the Duluth model we were just mentioning, and wider culture that's sort of pervaded by this idea of hegemonic masculinity and toxic masculinity. So I'm aiming to kind of integrate theories and concepts from neuroscience and family systems to support these dads as they try to settle their nervous systems, to understand and manage their trauma responses, to explore the relational dynamics with their ex-partners and their role in them, and to open space for healing and psycho-spiritual healing, but also to think strategically and be the best fathers that they can. So there's a lot that I don't know how much I'm going to be able to get. I don't know. I'm kind of looking forward to it, but I'm not sure how I'm going to get it.
Yeah, sounds very rich.
Yeah.
Very rich. Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
I look forward to it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to yours.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll have a think about the next chapter and message you.
We stop recording and just say cheerio to each other.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find the thing. Yeah, stop recording.